Welcome back to the Writing Bastards podcast. Today, we're going to talk about how a lot of fantasy traditionally has a certain sort of theme, sort of based in Europe, medieval, dragons, castles, things like that. But recently, there's been a lot of fantasy that's different from that, kind of explores different cultures, does different things with the tropes. And we're going to talk about what we like about that, what we see in recent books coming out. And yeah, so. We'll kick it off. I'm Neil here with Drake. We both
Hey,
write books. And I think the first question is, what do we think about books that focus on like martial arts as a magic system? It's something that's become more popular. I think you have opinions on this.
yeah, I do. I, yeah, I don't know. I think sometimes it's almost like an easy fallback because I think sometimes, I don't know, maybe this just is me, but growing up, there's like a lot of mysticism kind of behind like martial arts. I remember growing up and you like Dragon Ball Z, like Avatar: The Last Airbender, and then you'd have these people like, oh, come do our karate class, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna get like a six pack and I'm gonna be able to water bend. Like, I don't know. I just feel like generally, for me growing up, maybe in the West and where I lived, there was just not a lot of like learning about it. And maybe that is ever, I don't know. But to me, that's like my problem with it is when you use martial arts, it's almost like it's weird to me because martial arts the and all it is really just a fighting style. Like it's just a way of combat, right? I mean, at least to me, that's what it is. So that's almost, I find it weird when, it's these martial arts, like they're doing kung fu. And I think the last Airbender did it pretty well, to be fair. That was probably the best one I've ever seen because a lot of them they get into these like Tai Chi and the chakras, but it's not even necessarily like an elemental magic that they'll throw in with the Kung Fu. It'll just be like kind of like European magic systems. So it's kind of like that, but yet they can like do like they'll have to like swing their Bowie staff and do something and it like launches this fireball and it's that kind of cool sounding at times. But to me, I think that's just a trope that I don't really like as much because it would be like the equivalent of that is a knight swinging his sword around a few times and like throwing a fireball at you. And maybe they have that and I just haven't read it. I mean, media wise, like in a movie, it looks sick. I'd watch the movie 10 times out of 10 probably. But in a book, I think that's never portrayed very well. I haven't
Have you
read.
like seen that recently? Like what's making you think of it?
I am
I'm
trying to remember
curious.
the book it was that I read. There's one book, but we're talking about another point later that I want to save this one book for that has a little more particular ideas about the later point. So maybe I'll kind of bring it into this one later. But I think, what is it? What was the book? I'm trying to remember. Maybe it was, no, it wasn't The Art of Prophecy. I can't remember the book. I'll look it up and I'll tell you the next episode. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Wow, this sounds like good. Dissing on it, but I don't have a reference point. But I think one example of it that I like, for example, like when you think about it, you can look into anime and mangas as well, like Demon Slayer. To me, that is a martial arts system done well with their breathing. I think Naruto is a pretty good one too. It's to me, I think the issue derives from when it's just so solely based like that they have to learn this martial art to become these like superhumans. I mean, I think the best example, I'm gonna say this later, but it is the Poppy War books because they didn't necessarily use magic by the martial arts, but it was kind of like the martial arts were tied into their magic system that was tied into shamanism that had these mystic powers. And it just was kind of maybe it was confusing, but I was kind of like, so like the martial arts part of it, but like the shamanism's part of it, and like drugs are part. Like it was a really complicated, just almost like a mess. Like it was not a good work, like building of the magic system. And
Yeah,
I think that's
I think
kind of my
that's
problem.
a interesting like general point that anime became a lot more popular. And
Hmm.
so I think that has influenced books that come out now. And so there's
Hmm.
more books that take elements from the popular animes and sort of turn it
Hmm.
into like a fantasy. And that's a
Hmm.
pretty cool trend. Like I think a lot of people in the past complained about how a lot of fantasy was just based on like one aesthetic and now we're getting like different
Yeah.
ones, and it's interesting because like the one I think of that's like more like Asian fantasy is like the Cradle series,
Hmm.
technically indie published, Will White, but it's done well, and I've read the first couple books and they are good, but it's
Hmm.
not like martial arts. It's Asian, and they like train and like develop like magical energy, and then they
Hmm.
acquire like items and stuff
Hmm.
that like make them more powerful.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's pretty straight up like fantasy.
Okay.
I would almost compare it to like a Bleach, where like people go super
Oh,
deep
okay.
into like a skill set, and it's like kind of
Mm.
magic too. But it's not like as, I don't know, it doesn't suspend your belief as much as like just they learn to move in a certain way and then they have magic all of a sudden.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe it's just like a Western trope, but I always feel like with Asian portrayals, it's kind of like we think Asians are kind of like Jedi. Like, I don't know, that's like just to me, like you always see like a lot of Western, like I think the Forbidden Kingdom is one. I really like the Forbidden Kingdom movies, like Jackie Chan and Jet Li, but
Mm,
it's like kind of over the like they're superhumans pretty much like, and it's like all this like meditation and this Jedi stuff, and then all of a sudden they can do like these cool things. I think sometimes we fall into that like, oh, because they have really rigid discipline in meditation, it's like Star Wars, because that's Star Wars took it from Asia, right? I mean, Star
totally.
Wars is
Their
super like
outfits,
Kurosawa.
their
Like,
outfits are completely like Japanese looking,
yeah,
and
it's Space Samurai, that's all it is.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
like they even have
The
breakdowns
like
of like,
Darth Vader's helmet is a
yeah,
samurai helmet.
like, yep.
Like,
Have there's one it would be fun to show as a breakdown of all the scenes, because if you like watch Seven Samurai and then you watch like other Star Wars, like you can literally see where George Lucas got like all these like samurai
mm,
like scene inspirations. But I think that's why a lot of like, I don't know, or like Asia, like so Chinese, Japanese, even Korean, maybe Mongolian, all of those kind of movies that Hollywood produces, I think they have too much of that, they like Star Wars mindset, like, oh, this mystical land of Asia. When to me, it's like they're people, like we're all people, and martial arts is just a more fancy kind of term of their fighting styles, but to them, it's not fancy. I mean, if you, I've talked to several like karate instructors, kendo instructors, and they're like, dude, it's just fighting. Like, there's no like
so
magic to it, but.
is your point that you think it's a bit better done on the movie screen as opposed to in a book?
Mostly because the visual effects, you can make them look really cool. But I would say the ones that do it well, that isn't just visual effects, like Demon Slayer, I really like that because it's a breathing technique. But for some reason, that breathing technique allows them to channel this energy into this form. And I think that's a better way to do it, because they do have to train a lot. There is that kind of martial art thing. There's that trope, again, like the martial art trope in the training. But to me, that one just felt more natural because it wasn't like an infinite source of power like Star Wars, right? You train endlessly and then you meditate endlessly, and then you're just this force of nature. Like in Demon Slayer, they get beat up. They like, you get tired, you lose stamina, your breathing technique falls down. So I think that's why I like that one a lot. Avatar: Last Airbender was good because there was chakra and there's lots of limitations. I think sometimes that's the thing, is there's like not really a set limit. Maybe that's the problem with the books, is there's not necessarily like with the Asian magic systems. Where's the stopping point of like where powers intersect and all of those kind of like where how they build off? Because in the Last Airbender, not everyone is a firebender, like not everyone's an earthbender, and they all kind of have like, I can beat you. Like for example, like when I think it was Katara and Zuko are fighting, and the fish are in the pond at the, is it the south? No, it's the north. It's the North water tribe, and it's like the nighttime, and she's more powerful in the nighttime. But then the sun comes up, and he's more powerful. I thought that was cool because they integrated the martial arts with an element system, and I don't know. I just think it worked. It was kind of like a lucky guess that it just worked so well, because then they could tie it into a lot. But
Yeah, I feel like it's like not even that martial artsy. Like it's like
mhm.
feels quite just like fantasy,
Yeah,
which kind of
yeah,
helps. But
I think there's elements, and I think that's the problem is sometimes people also try and keep the Asian world too close to the real world equivalent. 'Cause I think like the last Airbender, there's Japanese influence, there's Chinese influence. Those are like the top two I can think right off. Like the Kyoshi warriors were very like samurai looking. I think the Fire Nation's very Chinese looking. But they digressed. Like it was more of like they took the inspiration of the art style and some of the culture aspects. They brought it over, but then they made their own world, own religion, own culture. And I think sometimes that's the issue is Asian fantasy isn't yet set up or established enough for them to have these like kind of fallback tropes. Like when you write a fantasy book that's kind of like a European, like you could say like The Witcher or whatever. Like if you're writing one, you have some very like reliable fallbacks that even if it's a very generic book you write, there's going to be a general audience that will be like, oh, it was an enjoyable book because it hit all the tropes I like. You know what I'm saying? But where I still feel like the Asian fantasies in like experimental stage. I mean, there's even a mecha one that I saw. It's called Black Widow or not like, Iron Widow. I haven't read it yet, but it's like a mech system, and I think like I don't know if they like sacrifice or like it like has to be a male and a woman paired together, and like the woman's like the energy, like the battery, and like they end up dying. It's kind of like it sound I know I just read the back and I was like, oh, and I might have misunderstood it, but I was like, that's there's just so much variation. I think the problem is people are kind of just like throwing them out because we're still as like I don't know, as a community of readers trying to figure out what tropes we enjoy and don't enjoy. Maybe that's the problem, but
now, now that you say it, I'm actually like, wait, hang on. Maybe the Fire Nation is supposed to be more Japanese, and then like I don't know what they call the Earth people. Um,
the the
what Earth
Earth
Nation? I can't
Nation, yeah,
remember.
yeah,
Like
they went
that,
really hard
like
on naming.
almost feels like Chinese
I
because
would
like they
agree.
have these like
Yeah,
giant cities, and then the
all
Japanese
Bossing
just
Say
like
and
show
stuff.
up.
Yeah,
Yeah, they show up on like
yeah.
boats and like attack and take over and
I would love to
like
see.
their
Yeah,
metal boats
yeah.
like feel very like
Maybe
Imperial
they
Japan
are.
vibes. I
Yeah,
totally
they
don't know
do.
if that's true, but
I
that
would
kind of
love to see if
aesthetic.
that's their inspiration because you know that does there is Asian history with that with the Fire Nation overtaking like peaceful nations and I wonder if that at all was inspired by like World
Yeah,
War II
I want
Imperial
to know.
Japan.
It's
That would be cool
totally
to
a guess,
ask. Like, no, that's cool. That's I never thought of it that way, but you know now that you say it, that could totally be true. Yeah. And Bossing
but
saying all the Earth cities are very like defending, like hard to break into and take
big
over.
walls.
Big well, yeah.
Uh, anyway,
Uh,
you talked about like shamanism a little bit.
hmm.
Just generally world building in fantasy, or sorry, building religions in fantasy. I'm curious your thoughts on that,
Yeah, no,
like how you would do it good.
I think yeah, I think it's religion and fantasy is hard. I've read some books that have done it really well. I think my one thing is I read The Poppy War and the first chunk of that book was really good. And then I just feel like it went on this weird, the last half was not what I felt like it was going to be. And I've read several reviews and there's been several people that have felt the same ways that it just has this weird tonal shift in the end. But in that book, there's shamanism, and they use shamanism to, I believe, kind of like connect with these like spirits, and the spirit comes inside of them, and then they like unleash the power. If I'm wrong, like someone feel free to comment and correct me. I did listen to it on an audiobook for a good chunk too, so I didn't read all of it. But and to me, I think it's hard because I've looked it up on Wikipedia many times. Is the best English word we really do actually have is shamanism, My problem is when I think of shamanism, I think of like this is really weird, but there's this game I played when I was younger called Pitfall Harry on the GameCube, and you could go and like find these like floating shaman dudes with these tiki masks on, and they'd like give you stuff. So whenever I hear the word shamanism, I just think of those like floating dudes and like their little grass skirts and like these tiki-ish looking masks. But I think shamanism, we don't, I don't know, maybe just I don't, but I feel like that word in general is kind of a weird word in English where it's kind of like
Yeah,
what
I
do
mean,
you think? If I
how
say shaman, what do you think of? Like, what do you
I
think
think
of?
I think of Warcraft 3 shamans. It's like a
Yeah,
unit. It's a
yeah,
unit that the orcs have, and they have like wolf skins, and
yeah,
they like shoot electricity and cast spells. But
yeah,
I mean, I don't really know the difference between that and just like general paganism. I mean, a lot of stuff is technically paganism, so
yeah.
like. I mean, is that sort of just like a catch-all, or like how does it manifest in the book, and what's your issue with it?
But the thing is that's not the shamanism that we would interpret it as. Because in Asia, shamanism is very different. I actually looked up some examples. One, so in Korea, they have one, the priestess are called, I believe it's pronounced mudang, and it's very similar to a Shinto style of religion where they
Hmm.
believe it's not polytheistic, I believe it's animistic. I'm gonna butcher the word.
I
It's kind of
mean,
where
it probably is also polytheistic if they
there's
believe
many
like
gods,
nature
yeah.
has gods, then yeah.
But they believe that like spirits are in everything, kind of like how Shintos believe, they have like the kami-sama of every
Like
thing.
every grain of rice has like a million gods in it or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that's not probably exactly how it is in Korea, but it's a similar system where they have these rituals and rites that a certain person performs. The like person has like the mudang has an awakening where like the god comes into them. But like when you look at pictures of them, they're in like these very flowy robes, big robes, headdresses, maybe carrying objects. So more of almost like it looks closer to what we would consider like a Catholic priest or like a priest in a European
Mm,
setting. Because I think our belief of a shaman is like Scandinavian dudes in the wilderness doing blood rituals. Like I think that's or paganism. I think that's kind of where in
yeah.
a Western mindset, when you hear the word shaman, you're thinking of like, yeah, the dude walking around the fire doing the ritual. And they might do that, but in Asia, it's a much different appearance. They might do
Mm,
similar rituals. And I think that was the problem, is when she says shamanism all of the time in the book, it just didn't it just didn't fit. And I think a better word would have been to, I think not a better word, a better way to do it would make your own terminology or use the Chinese word. Because then to me, I'm reading the Chinese word. I don't know what it is. I look it up. Shamanism, okay, but it's a different word. I think that's the problem is we've already stereotyped that word. But I didn't like in the book specifically about shamanism is that they took, um, it's like poppy seed, right? And poppy seed is an opioid, right? That's where opium is opium. Yeah, poppy seed makes into opium, which is an opioid. They would take this, get high to kind of like put themselves into that like shaman realm, right?
does that even make sense for like would for that like chemical effect?
I mean, opioids tend to be really good painkillers, and if you take enough, I mean, I'm sure you could get high and you could go on a dance trip up there. I don't,
I mean,
nothing's impossible.
apparently it's uncommon, and that's kind of what I
Hmm,
think. Like, I
hmm,
mean,
hmm.
I've had surgeries and they usually prescribe like that sort of painkiller.
Yeah,
And
open
like some
opioid.
people are like, maybe in your dreams, like you might have like a slightly weird dream, but I'm like, there's definitely other substances
Oh
that
yeah,
would impact you way more. Like, I don't think it's
yeah.
supposed to be like a
Yes.
psychedelic, so that's
And
an
that
interesting
was
choice, but.
so that was my thing, is it's kind of its own book, right? It's its own
I
nation,
I
its own
mean,
world.
maybe it's supposed to be like historical context, with China and opium or something. I don't know, but
But it's not even in China. That was the thing. It's Chinese influence, but they used poppy seed as opium, and that was kind of their transport into the gateway. Kind of like you could maybe have a similarity, like a Norwegian Viking doing some like ritual at the fire and inhaling some substance to go up into like the realm of
I mean,
whatever.
they used shrooms for that though. So
Okay,
it's
well,
like it actually makes
an actual
sense.
psychedelic. Yes.
I'm
Okay.
like
Yes.
they should have been like, yeah, it's DMT is like the
DMT.
like,
Oh my. Just
that's the way
insert.
people actually see like the machine elves when they take that or whatever it
Oh my
is.
heck.
On Reddit, people are always like talking about crazy stuff. That I can see, but
But
anyway, I'm getting distracted.
yeah, this podcast title is fantasy and psychedelic drugs. Boy,
DMT inspired fantasy?
you know what? There's probably a
Probably
good
write
chunk
an
that
interesting
is.
book. Yeah, you probably write an
Oh,
interesting book with that, but
probably, but
anyway.
yeah, no, I just think I think that didn't work very well because they could also become addicted to it. So I was kind of like, so you, and I'm not against necessarily having a magic source have issues. I think The Witcher, like you can drink potions and you become, and like it poisons you because, it's a poison, but it's, if you drink too much, that sort of thing. I get that. Like medicine's the same way in our world. You take too much, it becomes a poison. And I'm fine with that. But it was really where you just saw a ton of these like a lot of opium addicts, but you need that to talk to these gods. And then the gods are just selfish dirtbags, which didn't really bother me a ton. It kind of can make sense, but I don't know. It's just me like if you're like a selfish dirtbag god, why are you gonna help these people? Like you're just like, I mean, I think
Mm,
one movie that did it well was Clash of the Titans and Wrath of the Titans, whereas the worship of the gods ceased, they became weaker. So it's kind of like a
it is
mediocre trope,
interesting.
but it's a good way to like make the gods actually give a crap, right? Because they can be these egotistical dirtbags, but if people stop praying to them, they're like, oh no, I'm losing my powers. Like I better go like let me go bless your grains of rice and like help you guys out for a minute. But they don't really have that. I think it could have been a really cool book, but I just think using like opium as a psychedelic to access magic that is super OP magic just was weird to me.
Yeah,
And then
I
claiming
I
it was
think
shamanism was just, I just didn't like, off to me. But
yeah, I think religion is a super interesting thing to add generally because
hmm
so much of culture is downstream of religious belief.
hmm
And so I like it in fantasy in general. I think it's interesting.
hmm
Um, I think you can have really like unique characters and it makes like their background that's like if they have a weird background because they're into like some group, some religion, like it's very
hmm
believable, very interesting. The motivations can be cool. And then when you have interesting gods that do stuff, that just makes the stakes feel really high,
hmm
which I like that. Like that's something that I seek in books. So
hmm
I'm a pretty big fan. I bring up the Malazan Book of Fallen series like all the time, but
every podcast.
that's
We're gonna
that's
get
a
sponsored by him eventually.
that'd be the dream.
We'll sponsor you, buddy. We'll help promote your book.
Well, we're doing it for free, but he has all these like tons of gods, and the gods like rule over like areas of magic.
hmm
And so, like, people will sort of align themselves with a certain god and then, like, get that type
hmm
of magic. And they have, like, thrones that people will sit on, and they're the people who own that area. So gods can
Oh,
switch, like, the god of the
oh.
area can switch. And
Kind
then
of like
they're
Dark
all,
Souls almost sounding. Kind of like that's kind of cool. Like
yeah,
Lords of
they're
Cinder. That's
all
cool.
inscribed in this, like, magical deck of cards that it's not like a physical
Okay.
deck of cards, but it can basically like appear in manifest itself. And so there's
hmm
like characters in like this deck and like those are all the gods of the different areas, and so things will
Oh.
shift. Like some people will take over others, and
Hmm.
it's cool. And it's like the scale is just like eternal, really epic. So tons of the world building comes from it, and even down to specifics of how people speak. Like
Hmm.
there's a god of death called Hood, and so people are always like, oh, like Hood's name, like, and they're like
Oh,
using it as
yeah.
like a curse, but it's so
Hmm.
good because it kind of sounds like a Grim Reaper, but it's a little different.
Hmm.
Um, so that is like I feel like it's pretty central. Like fantasy should have some sort of higher powers, and that makes it really interesting, in my opinion. Not, it doesn't have
Yeah.
to, but I'm a big fan.
I think it helps. I think one problem is if you have higher powers that aren't going to be doing anything, then just maybe just having a name dimension is fine. Because one thing I definitely hate is when you kind of get some like world building on a god, you kind of learn about a god, and then they don't do anything. It's just kind of like it's almost like to me it feels like filler content where you're telling me about this cool god, and then like nothing. Like yeah, they're just there doing their thing, but we don't know. We're just humans. It's like okay, like yeah, I get that. But to me, it's so much more interesting is if there is some interaction, even if it's mysterious and they hide a lot from the reader. Having some interaction is awesome. I think that's what makes a lot of like the Greek god stories cool, is because you generally know like some characteristics of Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, and they interact with the people, but you can totally tell they have their own agendas. Like
Mm,
they need humans to facilitate what they want in the long run. So it's them just playing chess with humans. And I think that's always really fun because you're rooting for like Perseus, right? Through all these books, and you're like, oh yeah, like come on, like you can win. But in the back of your mind, you're like, but there's something else going on that's kind of in the like the background. And I think that just makes a really cool book. I mean, because
yeah.
I just
I
think it's
mean, might
cool.
as well have more interesting characters than not, I suppose.
And you don't need them to appear that much either, you know? It could be once a book, twice a book. You don't need them to be frequent flyers in the book, but
Mm,
just enough to kind of, this was going on, or like they show up, oh, here, like it's kind of like a Deus Ex Machina, excuse me. But where they like give them like a
Deuce.
Deus Ex. I'm bad at Latin too. I don't speak English very well anymore either. Just everything's going out. But
Take a big Deuce Ex Machina.
Deus Ex Machina. I'll refer to it from that now on as Deus Ex Machina. So
Um, anyway,
it's kind of like that. You get what I'm saying when they kind of pop up and like give him a sword,
yeah.
but it's cool because there's that interaction where it is the god coming and saving the protagonist, but it's also you can use that to propel the story in a cool direction. But
That makes sense. Um, Tropes of some of this newer age non-traditional fantasy that you see that you like or don't like. We've talked about some, but are there any others you were thinking of?
one that I don't necessarily love or hate, this is mostly in media. I'm trying to understand why it's a thing. So if anyone knows why this is a thing, please comment it. I've actually asked of several people and I've never gotten a good like an answer really. Is how come in like Chinese movies when they jump, they run with their feet and fly?
Mm,
I've never gotten a good answer to that and I've always wanted one because I don't think it's necessarily bad, but I don't get it, right? I mean, like if you can just fly, then just fly, you know? Maybe it's because I'm used to Superman who just kind of streamline flies everywhere. So that's not necessarily like a trope I hate or love. It's just a trope that I notice is very popular in a lot of Asian media, and I've always wondered if
mm.
there's a rhyme or a reason to it. It's kind of like why we have knights in armor fighting dragons in European like
Like,
fantasy.
why are there always dragons?
Yeah, why do we always have
Why do they
dragons and
always
everything?
breathe fire for
Exactly. Why
no
can't they?
explained reason?
One of these times they're gonna breathe water, and like people are gonna be like, "What?" Just look like a giant.
It's just a water gun.
Puke, just
Doesn't do
puking on
anything.
everybody. Just, I'm just saying, like, why do we have certain, like, I just want to know. I
It's
mean,
funny.
and I think the ones like in Asian tropes, a couple of the ones like martial arts are always used. Like, always a military. I've read a ton with a military academy, martial arts, um, the really annoying pain in the butt teacher who's a dirtbag and he has some like sad story, kind of like a Mr. Miyagi thing, only like way meaner. And I don't know if those are like good or bad, but to me it's kind of like it's a bit stale because I feel like Asian people aren't just like these people who are obsessed with like martial arts and victory, or I think honor's a big one because I think everyone watched like The Last Samurai. I love that movie, but everyone's like, "Oh, Asian people." And they like Mulan too. Like dishonor on your cow, dishonor on your family. Like I think they think like honor is like the like like, oh, I can never deviate from honor. So you always get the bad guy who's just this dishonorable, horrible guy, and then you get the like really like the kind of like the Mary Sue character, and I think it's just because we're still kind of experimenting with a lot of that fantasy. But those are tropes I generally don't like. I want to read a novel where, like, I read one, it's Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa. And that is literally a book about Musashi learning a martial art through like 900 pages. But it never felt like I was reading like a book about martial arts. It felt like I was learning about his journey as a person and all these things and that's what I've started to notice. The books that I read that are written by Asian authors about an Asian country tend to be way different than like an American or, someone who isn't Asian writing these books. And so that's to me kind of indicative that we have a stereotype or a contorted image of what it would be. And maybe that's because I've lived in Asia. Maybe I like see Asia differently because I've lived there and I've experienced it a lot. But to me, I mean, I just love a book about like no magic and it's just like this brutal samurai war book. I mean, that would be sick to me. Just like, I mean, there's one called the Taiko by Eiji Yoshikawa that I need to read where it's about the unification of Japan. And it's literally people are
Hmm.
like, dude, it's this big war epic where they're just riding on horses, fighting people. I'm like, yeah, like that's what like no one's really putting that out there that Asia can be this like, hey, yeah, they had like wars. They're pretty much just they are normal people that fought and killed each other. So we don't always need to have these like military academies. We don't need to have this like hierarchy that's weirdly based off of magic and kung fu. I mean, and one book I
It's
want to read is The Sword of Kaigen. I've heard that one's a lot better. I haven't read it yet, but when I read it, maybe we can like deviate back to this and I can
yeah.
alter my
Um,
opinion if anything.
it's interesting because it's like some of these fantasy books, it's people in the US,
Hmm.
um, or at least spend a lot of time here, regardless of what they look like,
Hmm.
who are writing these, and it's like a synthesis of some of like the Western fantasy and then Eastern stuff.
Yeah.
Because it's like anime is like started on its
Yes.
own, and
Yep.
it's like different from fantasy. So there's like some inspiration, but then there's some, from just like traditional fantasy out from like
Hmm.
Europe roots. And I think that's maybe what you're honing in on is that combination can be like
Deadly.
kind of interesting. And I also think, you're talking about these same tropes that appear over and over again. Like people in the US just like martial arts, right? It's like there's a whole
Oh yeah.
generation of kids who like the karate school program, it's like everybody was growing up
Yeah,
doing
I know.
karate.
I'm
Like,
one of those. I'm in that
like
generation too.
that was cool. Like people like
Hmm.
kung fu, like those sort of things. And it's just the same way as like if you look at anime and their portrayals of America, and it's
Oh
like
yeah, it's hilarious.
ultra American, like 6'4" blonde, like ridiculously buff,
Cowboy.
like even in Yu-Gi-Oh, like the American guy, he's got like an American bandana and like
Yep.
sunglasses, and he's like
Yeah.
jacked and stuff. And it's like it's
Yeah.
all a caricature, and
It's true. Okay, yeah,
We're just seeing the other side, and I agree
true.
with that. Like it's like, dude, like Japan, lived there for years, and everybody who goes to Japan generally likes it.
Hmm.
And but it's like my view of it is like I like it, but for different reasons sometimes, and there's things that
Yeah.
I don't like about it.
Oh yeah.
And like
Same.
it is very different. So yeah, I mean, I think if you want to go deeper, it makes sense to go with like the real authors, who will be mainly influenced by the area they're writing about rather than
Hmm.
someone else. But at the same time, like I think it's cool if people write about any
Yeah.
culture. Like I don't care. Like I don't think writing should be limited to specific backgrounds. Like anyone should write
Hmm.
what they want.
And I
But
don't want to come off like I'm
yeah.
saying like don't write it because I do think I like the direction. I really am happy that like fantasy people are now like, okay, let's try other cultures because we have really saturated the Europe culture. Like it is oversaturated. And so I enjoy how people are branching out. I think it's a very modern, like new development. And there's that growing pains, that experimental phase where all these different ideas are coming together. And then, I think in like X amount, like maybe 20 years, we're gonna have a pretty good like trope and a pretty good like idea and fantasy of Asia kind of put together. Um, but yeah, I just
Yeah.
think it's one of those that there's kind of like it's a little bit tropey with certain like the military academies where I'm like, try something. I guess my encouragement isn't that you shouldn't write it that way, but let's try like branch out. Like it's experimental phase with it right now. So like do something crazy, right? I mean, get out there, kind of make it your own too. I think that's the one thing, even when we call it European fantasy, it's not like it's not European, you know what I'm saying? Because fantasy has evolved so much into being its own thing. Like they kind of have the aesthetic, right? Like the long sword and the bow. But other than that, I mean, it's not in the armor sets. It's not super European, They don't. There's fantasies where like I think the Stormlight, they don't eat European food. They eat like spicy curry. The people that are in the European armor are supposed to look Asian. Like I think that's a good blend, It's fantasy's gotten to that way. So now let's get other fantasy into that own realm where it can kind of do its own thing rather than we're super hanging on tight to these stereotypes and these traditional idea thinkings of like what an Asian culture must be and like what we're interested in. Like let's push it beyond to something cool. I guess that's my
Yeah.
whole point.
That makes sense. I just thought of another that's a good novel about Asia written by a non-Asian is James Clavell's books.
Shogun, yeah, that's a
But
pretty
yeah,
good book.
and I mean
Yeah,
he wrote a bunch of other ones too. Like
yeah, King
people,
Rat,
yeah,
Gaijin, yeah, he's got a
but he
ton.
like when he was writing, he spent like years researching and then went and wrote the books. And so that's why like it's super atmospheric. Like,
Hmm.
if you've lived in Japan and then you like read Shogun, there's a lot of stuff that's like feels like kind of
Hmm.
relatable.
Oh yeah, I
So
love that book.
yeah,
I've read it several times because of that. Yeah, very
I think it's
atmospheric, if
like
anything.
your desire of accuracy and depth can be satisfied, but I guess you just
Hmm.
have to be aware of what you're reading.
Totally
Um,
agree.
Last closing question. So, world building in general, we've talked about a lot of this world building
Hmm.
stuff, especially in non-traditional fantasy. Um, how would you go about doing it uh, in a good way? I think there's good and bad.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, how I would go. I'm writing a book right now since I finished my second one and my other two. So I get to that editing. The third book I'm writing right now is very inspired off Japan. I mean, I've lived there long enough. I speak the language. I was like, okay, I think I'm brave enough to try an attempt at like, because for how much I just dogged on it, I'm like, okay, well now I got to do a really good job with it. And I think the first thing I did is I didn't want I kind of just took out the magic system because I didn't want to build it around a magic system. I was like, nope, let's get rid of that. And one thing that I feel like is not really built on a lot in Asia is, so one of my favorite time periods of Japan is the Sengoku era, which is the Warring State period. So my novel is kind of in this. It's I want people to not. It's hard to tell because there are some things I play with where this could be happening in the far future. This could be in the Sengoku era, or this could be in a different world. That's kind of how I want the reader to feel, is that like there's some familiarity and some connecting points, but there's some new stuff that's, where the heck is this from? But I've actually contacted I think the best way to go about this, and not everyone has this luxury like I do, but I have a lot of friends who are born in Japan, who are like living in Japan, native Japanese, that I've actually emailed them, who speak fluent English, and said, hey, when I finish this, would you guys read this to tell me how you feel about it? Do you feel like this is a good representation? Is it atmospheric? Um, is there things that are very like Western mindset that is not good, or if like would kind of just be blatantly stupid to have in there? Or and are there things that I missed that, like, oh, if you were kind of a Japanese inspired fantasy, so you're kind of a Japanese person, they wouldn't react this way. They'd do this, or like, and not doesn't mean I'm going to put it in the book, but I want them to read it so I can get really good feedback just based off of a culture. And one thing I've done too is, if I've started to build a touch of the magic system, but I've based it more on like Buddhism, where the magic system is more of, as people deviate from this Buddhism religion, they become this animalistic, violent people, and they almost like lose their mind and become just these savage like creatures. And I think that's kind of a cool way to integrate, maybe I'm wrong, maybe people hate it, a cool way to integrate religion into a magic system where it's not necessarily we do anything that's super flashy, but through meditation, these people are kind of purifying their soul so they do not become these like demons of war and destruction. Because in the book, they have like this unification army trying to unify the country, but yet there's these rumors of demons walking around the land, slaying and murdering people and burning villages. And so that was kind of me of adding that fantasy element into it.
You know what's funny is that's just like a very similar of tying religion and magic as my second book. Um, you go to like sort of like the middle, it's like in between afterlife where the gods live, and then you align with one of them, and then
Yeah,
they give you powers. So
yeah,
I'm a big fan.
yeah.
No need to convince me on that. That's I'm all on board. You've touched on the idea of like soft versus hard world building. What did you
Mhm.
mean by that?
Soft and hard world building. I think someone that is like, maybe it's more of a lighter detail than a harsher, more of a focused detail. Like for example, Brandon Sanderson is like almost over detailed in his world building. Like so much detail. Like holy crap. Like his books are long because of so much detail. Like, and I think an example of like the softer world building is more akin to Malazan. I'm not necessarily saying one is deeper than the other when I mean that. I mean the way in which it is given to the audience.
Yeah, it sounds like almost like explicit versus implicit.
Exactly. Yes, that'd be a better way to put
Um,
it. Yeah.
because yeah, Malazan's very much like you figure it out.
Hmm.
Um, it's nothing, things aren't explained to you clearly very often.
Hmm.
Um, and there are moments that like things sort of like happen and come and go, and so much happens in the books
Hmm.
that it's like, yeah, like it can feel like a lot happens with not as much detail, but I mean,
Yes.
you've always talked about how you like drip feeding world building and
Love drip feeding.
not just doing exposition or whatever. And I don't
Yeah.
think, Brandon Sanderson's sitting down and writing exposition much either, but there's
No.
certainly
It's a good
degrees to
balance,
which
but
you reveal. information. I like that too, generally. I think that's
Hmm.
there's because that's like how you add like suspense into a story and like wanting to know something's mentioned and then, you know, what does that mean? I don't know if you've watched Severance. Um,
Severance.
it's a new show that's coming out. I watched the first season right when it came out, have been a fan before
Okay.
it was well known,
Hmm.
but the second season is out now and everyone's talking about it. But that's
Hmm.
one where they do this really well, where it's like early on in a season, they'll like mention something once or twice, and you it's like clear that it's like an important thing. And so you're just wondering what that is. And
Yeah.
so this might go outside the bounds of like what fantasy is supposed to be, but I think you can have some of it. You know, like it's not supposed to
Hmm.
necessarily be like a mystery, but um
I think good fantasy
some
does have
more
some
than
mysterious elements to it.
yeah. I think it definitely is rarely a bad thing. But
I mean, that's what
any
makes
last
magic
thoughts here?
magic, though. That's like, I think that's one point that I'd agree with heavily is not fully understanding everything is what makes fantasy fantasy. I think that's the only thing I
It's
don't
true.
like about Sanderson is he turns it into a science, but that's his style, and some people love it. To me, I like magic being mysterious, not because as humans we don't have all the answers to everything in life anyway. We think we know everything, but we still don't know a lot, even with science. Like I remember taking college classes, and they're like, "Yeah, we don't really have a great explanation for this, but it just happens." It's like, oh, this is at a college level, and they're just basically like, "Better luck next time," you know. And I think I like that in fantasy too, where it's we know that, like for example, we know that if we meditate, like in my book, we don't become these demons of hatred and these evil little destructive beings. We don't necessarily know why. Maybe me as an author, I know exactly why, but I'm not going to tell people. I'll leave little breadcrumbs that if you're paying attention, they start getting a better idea as the story progresses. Oh, this and this, and then what was the role of that, like the Buddha or like in this enlightenment? I think that is a good way to do it. Keep things mysterious. I like having a drip fed world. I'd almost encourage people when you do write to make it like try and do less and less and less detail, and then in your beta reads and alpha reads people can say you need to add more detail, and it's so easy to do it then because then you can just ramble on what you wanted to ramble on. Because the problem is if you ramble before you finish the book, I feel like sometimes you'll go off on this deviation for 20 pages and then rip the reader back into it, and then you have a 500-page novel that when people read they're like, yeah, it could be 200. Like you could cut that down significantly. And I think that's why I like drip feeding and I like trying to do less detail because in all those beta reads that you're going to do as a writer anyway, when people read it, if your beta readers are like, what the heck, we don't get any of this, then that's where you go in and add it. I just think it might just be my personal writing style is I prefer to go back in to add detail than cutting. Cutting is harder because I need to then look at is it important? Why isn't it important? Versus if I do a drip fed, it's like I told you, I try and keep all my books. My first thought is write a 100-page book, which never happens because it always goes longer, but it keeps me in the mindset of only put in things that are of the utmost important to the story. And then once I'm finished with that, if there needs to be more details and more things fleshed out, that will naturally be figured out just through beta reading. But I think that would be my final thoughts on the whole soft versus hard or the implicit versus explicit kind of building. So,
Well said. Um, well, let's wrap it up there. Please subscribe if you want to hear more about us talking about books, writing, characters. We'll catch y'all next time.
okay, see you guys.